The lawyer finished reading my father's will, set down the papers, and looked up at the room, and my name had not been spoken once. I sat in a stiff leather chair in that law office, still jet-lagged from the flight home, and I waited for it, waited for my name, the way you wait for the other shoe to drop, the way you wait for a sentence to finish. The house had gone to my brother. The investment accounts had gone to my brother. The car, the land, the small business my father had spent 40 years building, all of it, to my brother, David. And the lawyer kept reading, and my father's estate kept flowing in one direction, and I sat there and slowly understood that there was no other shoe. There was no unfinished sentence. My father had left me nothing. Not the house I grew up in, not a keepsake, not a dollar. My name simply wasn't in the document at all, as though I had never existed. Across the table, my brother David had the grace, at least, to look uncomfortable. But his wife Kimberly did not. Kimberly was smiling, a small, satisfied, victorious smile, and when the lawyer finished, she reached over and squeezed David's hand, and she said to the room, "Well, I think Robert made his feelings very clear." Robert? My father, she said his name like she'd known him better than I had. I did not cry. I did not argue. I sat very still, because something was wrong, and I am a person who, when something is wrong, goes quiet and pays attention instead of reacting. Because the man that Will described, a father who would cut his only daughter out completely, without a word, without an explanation, was not the father I had known, and I could not make the document match the man. And when a thing you're being shown does not match the truth you know in your bones, you do not accept the thing. You find out why it's lying. What I didn't know yet, what none of us in that room knew, except perhaps the quiet lawyer gathering his papers, was that my father had left one more thing, something that wasn't in the will. Something he'd given his attorney with very specific instructions about when to share it, and in about 20 minutes, that lawyer was going to reach into his desk, pull out his phone, and play a voicemail that would turn everything in that room upside down. But let me back up. Because the story of how I sat in a lawyer's office and heard my own father erase me doesn't start with that will. It starts 2 years earlier, with a phone call, a plane ticket I didn't buy, and the slow, deliberate work of a woman who decided that my father's estate belonged to her. My name is Grace Bennett. I'm 40 years old, and for 12 years I served in the United States Army as a civil affairs officer before transitioning to work as a contractor doing humanitarian logistics overseas, the unglamorous, essential work of getting aid, infrastructure, and stability into places that have been broken by disaster or conflict. My whole career has been spent far from home, in hard places, doing work that matters to strangers. It's meaningful work. But it came with a cost I didn't fully reckon with, until it was almost too late. I was always the one who was away. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, the younger of 2 children. My brother David was 3 years older, and we were close as kids, less close as adults, not through any falling out, just the ordinary drift of different lives. David stayed in our hometown, worked at our father's business, married young. I left at 18 for the Army, and, in a sense, never really came back. Not because I didn't love my family. I loved them fiercely, but my work took me across the world, and home became a place I visited rather than lived, a place I called from time zones away, a place I meant to return to properly someday, when the work slowed down. My father, Robert Bennett, was the center of my world even from a distance. He'd raised us mostly alone after my mother died when I was 12, a plain-spoken, hard-working man who ran a small equipment and supply business, coached both our Little League teams, and never once made me feel that my leaving had disappointed him. Quite the opposite. He was proud of my service in a way he didn't have words for. He'd tell his friends about my daughter, over there doing important things, and I'd hear about it secondhand, and it would make my chest ache with love from 6,000 miles away. We talked every week, without fail, no matter where I was in the world. A phone call every Sunday. For 20 years, those Sunday calls were the fixed point around which my whole scattered life turned. So you can understand why the will made no sense. A father who called his daughter every Sunday for 20 years does not erase her from his life's work without a word. Something had happened, and I had a terrible feeling I knew when it started. It started about 2 years before he died, when David married Kimberly. I didn't dislike Kimberly at first. I barely knew her. I was overseas for the wedding and met her only twice in person, both times briefly. But I noticed things, in the way you notice things when you love someone from a distance, and the distance sharpens your attention rather than dulling it. I noticed that after Kimberly came into the family, my father's Sunday calls started to change. He grew more tired, more distracted. He'd mention, vaguely, that Kimberly and David were helping out more with the business and with his affairs, now that he was getting older. He'd started having some health troubles, his heart, some memory lapses that worried him, and Kimberly, who had worked as a bookkeeper, had so generously offered to take over managing his finances and his household. I remember the first time a Sunday call didn't happen. He'd never missed one. I called and it rang out, and when I finally reached him days later, he seemed confused about the missed call and said Kimberly had been handling his phone because it confused him. My father, who had run a business for 40 years, was suddenly a man who couldn't handle his own phone. That was the first vital sign that something was wrong. I noted it, and I worried, and, because I was 10,000 miles away in the middle of a complex operation, I told myself I was being paranoid, that I should be grateful someone was there to help him when I couldn't be. I was not being paranoid. I was watching, from a great distance, the slow isolation of my father, by a woman who had done the math and understood that if she could control his information, his money, and his access to the daughter who might notice, she could reshape his entire estate around herself and her husband. And the thing that made me most vulnerable to it, the thing Kimberly counted on, was my guilt, because I was always away. I had missed the wedding, missed the birthdays, missed the slow decline, and a person who is already primed to feel guilty is a person who is easy to convince that they've forfeited their place. Over those 2 years, the isolation deepened. My Sunday calls got harder to complete. Kimberly was always the one who answered now. She'd say Dad was napping, or not feeling up to it, or having a confused day. When I did get through, my father sounded further away each time, and once he said something that broke my heart, and that I now understand was a seed being planted. "You're so busy over there, Gracie. I don't want to be a burden to you. David and Kimberly, they're right here. They take care of everything." Someone had been telling my father that I was too busy for him, that I'd chosen my work over my family, that David and Kimberly were the ones who really cared. The last time I spoke to my father, about 3 months before he died, I told him I loved him and that I was going to arrange leave to come home and see him properly. There was a pause, and then he said, in a voice that didn't sound like his own, "That would be nice, Gracie, if you can find the time." And Kimberly's voice in the background said something I couldn't quite hear, and the call ended. I booked the leave. I was 3 weeks from flying home when I got the call that he had died. I've replayed the months before that final call more times than I can count, looking for the moment I should have known, the moment I should have dropped everything and flown home, regardless of the operation I was running or the leave I hadn't been granted yet. There were signs. There were so many signs. There was the Christmas card that year. My father had sent me a card every single year of my life, in his own cramped handwriting, and that year the card came typed, signed, Robert and the family, in handwriting that wasn't his. There was the time I sent him a long letter and a package of photos from my work overseas, things I knew he loved to see, and when I asked about them on a call weeks later, he seemed to have no idea they'd ever arrived. There was the Sunday I called and a strange thing happened, he answered, sounding like himself for the first time in months, and he started to say, "Gracie, I need to tell you something about," and then the line went muffled, like a hand had covered the phone, and when he came back his voice had changed, gone flat and distant, and he said he had to go. I know now what he'd been about to tell me. I know now that Kimberly was in the room, that she was always in the room, that she'd built a wall of small interceptions, the screened calls, the typed card, the vanished package, the muffled phone, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a barrier that slowly, deliberately, cut a father off from the daughter who loved him. And the terrible genius of it was that every single piece could be explained away. An old man forgets a package. Someone helps with the Christmas cards. A call drops. Nothing you could point to. Nothing you could prove. Just a growing distance that I, 10,000 miles away and already drowning in guilt about that distance, was perfectly positioned to misread as my own failure rather than someone else's design. I flew home for the funeral in a fog of grief and guilt so thick I could barely see through it. And Kimberly, I have to hand it to her, played the fog like an instrument. At the funeral she was the picture of the devoted daughter-in-law, accepting condolences, managing everything, subtly casting herself as the one who'd been there at the end, while I was off in some far-flung country. People I'd known my whole life looked at me with a coolness I didn't understand until later. Kimberly had spent 2 years telling anyone who'd listen that Robert's daughter had abandoned him. And in my grief, half believing it myself, I didn't defend against it. I just absorbed it, because some part of me thought I deserved it. Which brings me to that law office, 3 days after the funeral, and the will that skipped my name. When the lawyer finished reading, and Kimberly delivered her little line about my father making his feelings clear, I sat there in the silence and felt the whole room waiting to see what I would do. David wouldn't meet my eyes. Kimberly was watching me with barely concealed satisfaction, and I understood, looking at her face, that this was the moment she'd been working toward for 2 years. She wanted me to break down, or to explode, or to storm out, any of which would have confirmed the story she'd built, the story of the unstable, absent daughter who'd abandoned her father and now had the nerve to be upset she got nothing. I did none of those things. 12 years in the army and a career in the world's hardest places had taught me that when you walk into an ambush, you do not react the way the ambush is designed to make you react. You stay calm. You gather information. You do not give the enemy the response they've planned for. So I turned to the lawyer, an older man named Walter Osei, who had been my father's attorney for over 30 years, since before I was born, and I said, calmly, "Mr. Osei, I have one question. Did my father write this will himself? And when?" And something changed in Walter Osei's face. A flicker. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time, and I saw something in his eyes that I can only describe as relief, as though he'd been waiting to see whether I would ask the right question, and I had. "Miss Bennet," he said slowly, "that is a very good question. This will was executed 14 months ago. It was prepared by a different attorney, not by me. Your father came to me only afterward to file it." He paused, and his eyes moved, just briefly, to Kimberly, and then back to me. And when he did, he left something else in my care, with instructions. Kimberly's smile faltered. What is she talking about? The will is the will. It's legal. It's filed. It's done. The will is legal, Walter agreed. But your father, Miss Bennet, was a careful man, and a man who, I think, understood his own situation better than the people around him realized. When he filed this will with me, he also gave me his phone, and he asked me to preserve a particular voicemail, and he gave me very specific instructions about when to play it. Walter folded his hands on the desk. He told me, if my daughter Grace comes to the reading of this will, and if she asks whether I really wrote it, play her the message, and if she doesn't ask, if she just accepts it and walks away, then play it for her anyway before she leaves the state. But I don't think she'll just accept it. She notices things. She always has. The room had gone completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. Kimberly had gone very still. "I don't think this is appropriate," Kimberly said, and there was an edge in her voice now, a crack. The will is settled. I don't see why we need to listen to." "Because Robert Bennett instructed me to," Walter said, and for the first time there was steel under the old man's mildness. "And he was my client for 30 years, and I intend to honor his instructions." He reached into his desk drawer, and he took out an old phone, and he navigated to a saved voicemail, and he set the phone in the center of the table. "This message is dated 11 months ago, 3 months after the will was signed. I'd ask everyone to listen." And he pressed play. And my father's voice filled that room. It was unmistakably him, a little frailer than I remembered, but him, that plain-spoken Oregon voice I'd heard every Sunday for 20 years. And what he said, I will remember for the rest of my life. "Walter, it's Robert. I need to tell you something, and I need it on the record, so I'm leaving it here where Kimberly can't get to it, because she's got her hands on everything else." A pause, a breath. "That will I signed a few months back, the one that leaves everything to David and cuts Grace out. I need you to know I was pressured into that." Kimberly set it up. She brought in her own lawyer, told me it was just updating some paperwork, told me Grace didn't need anything, because Grace has her own life and doesn't care about us anyway. And I was tired, and I was scared, and my memory's not what it was, and I signed it because it was easier than fighting. But it's not what I want, Walter. It's not true. Grace calls me every Sunday. She has never once abandoned me. Kimberly's been keeping her away from me, keeping her off the phone, filling my head with stories. My daughter loves me, and I let them cut her out because I was weak, and I'm ashamed of it. Another pause. And then, his voice breaking. "So, here's what I need you to do. I'm going to come see you, and we're going to fix this properly. Make a new will. Do it right. But my heart's bad and I don't know how much time I've got, so if something happens to me before I can get in to see you, if I run out of time, I need you to make sure Grace hears this. I need her to know that I did not choose this, that I never stopped loving her, that she was never a burden, not for one single day. Tell her the truth, Walter. Promise me you'll tell her the truth." The message ended. The silence in that room was absolute. I realized I was crying, not the controlled tears I'd held back through the whole reading, but something deeper, something that came from 20 years of Sunday phone calls and a lifetime of a love I'd spent 3 days believing my father had thrown away. He hadn't. He never had. He'd been trapped and frightened and manipulated, and even so, even in his weakness, he'd found a way to reach forward past his own death to tell me the truth. I want to try to describe what it's like to hear the voice of a parent you've lost, saying the exact words your broken heart most needed to hear, at the exact moment you'd almost stopped believing them. For 3 days I had carried a stone in my chest, the belief that the last verdict my father had rendered on my life was rejection, that he'd weighed my years of service, my distance, my missed Christmases, and found me wanting, that the erasure of my name from his will was his final, considered judgment. I had been preparing, in those 3 days, to spend the rest of my life with that stone, to accept that I'd failed him, that the guilt was deserved, that I'd chosen the world over my own father, and this was the price. And then his voice filled that room and lifted the stone clean out of my chest with 14 words. "She has never once abandoned me. She was never a burden. My daughter loves me. I hadn't just been given evidence. I'd been given my father back, the real one, the one who'd coached my Little League team and bragged about me to his friends and called me Gracie, the one who saw me clearly even through the fog Kimberly had wrapped around him. That was the true inheritance. Everything else was just property." And across the table, Kimberly's face had gone the color of paper. "That doesn't prove anything," she said, but her voice had lost all its confidence. He was confused. His memory was going. "That's just an old man rambling." "Ms. Bennet," Walter said, cutting her off, and it was clear he meant me, not her. "Will you come see me tomorrow morning? Alone? I believe we have a great deal to discuss, because your father did not just leave that voicemail. Before he passed, he did manage to take a few more steps than Kimberly realizes, and I think you're going to want to hear about them." I looked at Kimberly, and I did not gloat, though God knows I had earned the right. I just looked at her, and I said, quietly, "You should have remembered something about me, Kimberly. My whole career is built on going into broken places and finding out what really happened. You spent 2 years counting on me being too far away and too guilty to look closely." I stood up. "You forgot that looking closely is the only thing I've ever been good at." The next morning, I sat across from Walter Osei in his office, the same office my father had trusted for 30 years, and he told me what my father had managed to do in the months before he died. It turned out my father, after leaving that voicemail, had done more than just intend to fix things. Frightened and running out of time, he'd taken 2 concrete steps that Kimberly, for all her control, hadn't managed to block. First, he had come to see Walter, once, quietly, when Kimberly thought he was at a doctor's appointment, and he had begun the process of drafting a new will. He hadn't finished it. His health gave out before he could execute it formally. But he'd left a signed, dated letter of intent in Walter's care, in his own handwriting, laying out clearly what he actually wanted: the estate divided fairly between his 2 children, with specific items designated for me, my mother's ring, the fishing cabin where he'd taught me to cast a line, a share of the business. And second, this was the piece that changed everything legally. My father had, months earlier, opened a small trust account that Kimberly never knew about, funded quietly over time, with me as the sole beneficiary. It wasn't the bulk of his estate, but it was his way of making sure that no matter what happened with the will, no matter what Kimberly engineered, his daughter would not walk away with nothing. It was, Walter explained, a message as much as a mechanism. I found a way to take care of you that they couldn't touch. None of this by itself overturns the will automatically, Walter told me. The law doesn't work that fast or that cleanly, but taken together, the voicemail, the letter of intent, the hidden trust, and the pattern they establish, this is very strong evidence that the will was the product of undue influence. That your father was isolated, pressured, and manipulated into signing something that did not reflect his wishes. And undue influence, Miss Bennet, is grounds to challenge a will. With this much evidence, and with my testimony as his attorney of 30 years, I believe you have a very strong case. I asked him why he hadn't done something sooner, why he'd let the will be read at all, if he'd known. Walter was quiet for a moment. "Because I couldn't act on my own," he said. "A voicemail and a letter of intent are evidence. They're not a magic wand. Someone had to bring the challenge, and that someone had to be you. Your father knew that. That's why he left the message the way he did, as a key, for you to pick up. He was betting that if you heard the truth, you'd know what to do with it." He almost smiled. "He seemed very confident you would," he said, and I wrote it down. "Grace will know. She always knows what to do when everyone else is falling apart. It's what makes her good at her job. It's what'll make her win." Over the following months, because these things take months, not the tidy afternoon television promises, I did exactly what my father had bet I would. I did what I'd spent my whole career doing. I went into a broken situation, and I methodically, calmly, found out what had really happened, and I built the case. I hired a lawyer. Walter, being a witness, couldn't represent me, but he pointed me to an excellent estate litigator named Frances Adeyemi, a silver-haired woman of about 60 with a cluttered office and a coffee maker that had clearly outlived several administrations, who listened to my whole story without interrupting once. When I finished, she took off her reading glasses and said, "Ms. Bennett, I'll tell you two things. The first is that undue influence is one of the hardest things to prove in estate law, because the influence usually happens behind closed doors, with no witnesses, to a vulnerable person who can no longer testify. Most people who suspect it have nothing but a bad feeling. They lose." She tapped the file. "The second thing is that you are not most people. You have a recorded confession, in the deceased's own voice, describing the manipulation as it happened. You have a signed letter of intent. You have a hidden trust that shows his real wishes, and you have his attorney of 30 years prepared to testify. In 31 years, I have rarely seen an undue influence case this well documented. Your father didn't just love you, Ms. Bennett. He armed you. We built it carefully. We gathered the phone records that showed how my calls had been intercepted and screened. We found the different attorney who drafted the original will and established that Kimberly had arranged the whole thing, had been present, had done the talking. We documented my father's declining health and the timeline of his isolation. And at the center of it all was the voicemail, my father's own voice, telling the truth he'd been too frightened to tell while he was alive. The phone records, when Frances pulled them, told their own quiet, damning story, and going through them was one of the hardest things I did in that whole process. Because there, in columns of dates and call durations, was the shape of what had been done to us. My Sunday calls, 20 years of them, appeared faithfully, week after week, and then, starting about 2 years before he died, they began to change. First, the durations got shorter, calls that used to run 40 minutes dropping to 4, to 2, to a handful of seconds. Then came the pattern of missed calls, my number ringing his phone again and again with no answer, clustered on the Sundays I remembered aching over. And most painful of all, the records showed calls he'd tried to make to me, calls I never received, calls that lasted only seconds before being ended, as though someone had taken the phone from his hand mid-dial. My father had been reaching for me in those last months, and someone had been pulling his hand back from the phone. I sat in Frances's office and looked at the evidence of my father trying to call his daughter and being stopped, and I had to put the papers down and step outside for a few minutes before I could go on. Frances was gentle about it. "I know this is hard to look at," she said when I came back, "but I want you to understand what these records mean, beyond the grief. A jury, a judge, they will look at this and see exactly what you see. A man systematically cut off from a daughter who never stopped calling. This isn't a bad feeling anymore, Ms. Bennett. This is a documented pattern, and patterns are what win undue influence cases." The weeks were hard, in ways I didn't expect. My brother David and I had to reckon with each other, and that was its own kind of grief. Because David, I came to understand, had not been the architect of any of it. He'd been almost as manipulated as our father, carried along by a wife who managed his beliefs the way she managed everything else. When David finally heard the full voicemail and saw the evidence, something broke open in him. He came to me, and he wept, and he said he'd let Kimberly convince him that I really had abandoned the family, that I really didn't care, that it was only right the estate go to the ones who'd stayed. He was ashamed. And I had a choice to make about my brother, and I chose, in the end, to believe that he'd been deceived rather than complicit, because the evidence supported it, and because our father, in that voicemail, had wanted his children to have a fair share each, which meant our father had never stopped loving David either. Whatever Kimberly had done, she'd done it to both of us. Kimberly fought, at first. Then, as the evidence mounted and it became clear that the voicemail alone was going to be devastating in front of a judge, she fought less. Her own lawyer, once he understood what we had, advised her that contesting our challenge would only prolong an outcome she couldn't prevent and would expose her to serious consequences of her own, given the pattern of manipulation the evidence revealed. I won't dramatize the resolution, because the truth was more powerful than any drama. The will was successfully challenged on the grounds of undue influence. The court, presented with my father's own voice, describing exactly how he'd been pressured, along with the letter of intent and the trust, honored what my father had actually wanted. The estate divided fairly between David and me, with the specific items my father had named for me: my mother's ring, the fishing cabin, my share of the business, restored to me as he'd intended. It was never about taking everything from David. My father hadn't wanted that, and neither did I. It was about honoring the truth over the lie, and about making sure that the last thing my father ever tried to do, take care of his daughter, actually came to pass. Kimberly's marriage to David did not survive the discovery of what she'd done. I won't pretend I was sorry, but I also stopped thinking about her almost entirely. She wasn't my battle. My battle had only ever been for the truth, and the truth had won. I did not gloat, not once, and it's the thing I'm most proud of. Because the victory was never sweet in the way revenge is supposed to be sweet. It was something quieter and better than that. It was the restoration of a truth that had almost been buried. That my father loved me, that he'd never abandoned me, that I'd never abandoned him, and that the 2 years Kimberly had spent isolating us had not, in the end, been strong enough to erase 20 years of Sunday phone calls. Life settled, slowly. David and I rebuilt our relationship, carefully, over time. We're closer now than we've been since we were kids, bonded by the shared understanding of how we'd both been played, and by the shared grief of the father we'd both loved and, in different ways, both been kept from at the end. I took my share of the business and eventually came home more. Not all the way. My work still matters to me, but enough. Enough that the fishing cabin gets used. Enough that home stopped being a place I called from far away and started being a place again. I kept my father's voicemail. Walter transferred it to me, and I have never deleted it, and I never will. Sometimes on a Sunday, because Sundays are still hard, will always be hard, I play it, just to hear his voice. She was never a burden, not for one single day. I play it, and I let myself cry, and then I go outside and I feel him with me, the way you feel the people who loved you enough to fight for you even after they're gone. I've backed it up in 3 different places. It is, without question, the most valuable thing I own, worth more than the cabin, more than my share of the business, more than my mother's ring, though I treasure all of those too. Because those things are memory. The voicemail is his voice, still speaking, still telling the truth, still refusing, even now, even from the far side of goodbye, to let anyone convince me I was anything less than loved. People ask me sometimes whether I regret my career, whether all those years away, in all those far places, were worth it, given that they gave Kimberly the opening to nearly erase me. And I've thought about it hard. The honest answer is complicated. I regret the Sundays I couldn't be there in person. I regret that my father spent his last months more isolated than he should have been. But I don't regret the work, because the work is who I am. And my father knew that, and he was proud of it, and he never once asked me to be someone smaller. The distance was real, but it was never the same as absence. Kimberly tried to turn one into the other. She failed, because a father who calls his daughter every Sunday for 20 years knows the difference, even when he's tired and frightened and manipulated, knows it well enough to leave a message in an old lawyer's care, betting that his daughter would come home and ask the right question. So if there's one thing I'd want you to carry out of my story, it's this. When someone shows you a document, a decision, a version of events that doesn't match the person you know in your bones, do not accept it just because it's official, just because it's written down, just because everyone in the room seems to believe it. Documents can be manufactured, wills can be pressured, stories can be built, patiently, by people who benefit from you believing them, but the truth leaves a trail, and the people who love you leave you keys, and your job, when everyone else has accepted the lie, is to be the one who asks the question nobody else will ask. Did he really write this? And when? And if you are ever sitting in a room where they've just finished reading you out of someone's life, and a quiet old man reaches into his desk and says there's one more thing, lean in. Because sometimes the last gift the people who love us leave behind is the truth itself, preserved and waiting, in their own voice, for the moment we're finally ready to hear it. My father left me a voicemail. It was worth more than the whole estate, because it told me the one thing I'd almost let them steal from me, that I was loved, that I was never a burden, and that I had a father who fought for me with the last of his strength, from the far side of goodbye. Thank you for spending this time with me. If Grace's story reached something you've lived through, or someone you love who was written out of a life they were told they didn't matter in, I'd be honored if you shared it. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever refused to accept a lie that everyone else believed and turned out to be right? And if you'd like to hear more stories about quiet strength, hard-won truth, and the ways love reaches us even after the people we love are gone, I hope you'll subscribe and join me again. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people who've truly earned a place in your life.